Hello and welcome. It's me, Nathan, your friendly neighborhood support engineer, also known as the guy who does the YouTube tutorials every once in a while. It's a pleasure having you with us. Thank you for joining our GCS certificate training. For those of you who did not get the memo, we will be taking tests after this. I will try my best to give you as much information as possible and point you in the right direction so not only you could better understand Grandstream as a whole, but also get into how you can sell our equipment, how you can help people out in the real world when it comes to solving their communication issues. Like all businesses, we need to be able to communicate first before we could sell anything. So, they can't do it if they can't talk. So that's what the Unified Communication Solutions training is going to be about. We're not going to just talk about the IPPBX or UCM series. And we're not just going to talk about only the phones. We're going to talk about it holistically in its approach. We're going to be going into GS Wave, different methods that we can communicate, conferencing, a whole plethora of stuff that we're going to dive into. But thank you for joining me. Throughout this, I will be making notes of some interesting topics throughout the PowerPoint presentation. Obviously, there is a test. I'm going to do my best to give you as much information as possible. And if you hear me say something like, this is very interesting thing to note, write that down. It may be a question on the test. I'm just saying. With that being said, let's go ahead and get started. Feel free to ask questions. I will be available on chat for you guys. I'll be constantly writing back to anything if you have any further questions or you might need something expanded upon. Just hit me up through the chat if you could. And if you want, try to make it public chat for some of your questions. I'll try my best to get to every one of them. But beyond that, let's go ahead and get started and roll into our first slide. All right, slide numero uno. So for today's agenda, we're going to kind of go along the UC solutions as a whole. Why should we even use VoIP? That's a good question. We're going to get into the introduction to UC solutions or Unified Communication Solutions, and how we're positioned in the UC market. We're going to do overall UCM overview and specifications. Definitely going to be some test questions on some specifications regarding our PBX installation and deployment, how we can work as a call management solution, other UC features that are not only going to be geared for the UCM, but UC solutions as a whole, GS Wave, our phones, Android applications, stuff like that. We also have third-party integration with a lot of our UC solutions. One of my favorite things I like to tell my customers is if you had third-party equipment and it's not working, I want to know about it so we can get it working. So we are very third-party friendly if we can. And last but not least, at the very end, we're going to do a certificate exam. I wouldn't stress about it too much. You have an amazing instructor. But beyond that, let's go ahead and dig in. Why use VoIP? Well, one of the reasons why you'd want to use VoIP is how cost effective it is. A VoIP trunk is very, very cheap when considering, if you have customers that come from analog lines, old PRI systems, E1, T1, all those older technologies do get really expensive at times, and it's hard for both new and existing businesses to compete when they're constantly being bombarded by these huge costs just so that they can talk to their customers. Having a VoIP system puts you on some of the most advanced technology available, especially when you're going with Grandstream. What's really nice about our equipment is once you buy our product, you're not stuck with just what you bought. We do firmware updates. We're constantly updating our equipment, trying to give our customers more features, give you guys an edge into selling our equipment and making it palatable for anyone who's looking for a unified communication solution. So with some of the advantages of VoIP, easy to implement. VoIP is very easy to implement as long as you have an internet connection. You could very easily register to your VoIP provider as if you were an extension on a phone, username, password, everything else. You need to know what their domain or their IP is to register to. Once you made that VoIP connection, set up inbound and outbound routes, boom, you're ready to go. You're able to make calls outward, receive calls inward. Then we can go into the finer details of actually how we want those configured. Another advantage is centralized and manageable VoIP solution. What do we mean by that? We can have one UCM control a couple other different locations. Sometimes we might want to have our UCM do a multi-tenant environment where we might have more than one company operating within the same office building, but they need the same VoIP solution because they want in on these good feature-rich and scalable solutions. We could also do peering with our PBXs as well, which we'll get into later. Less landline expense. We all know that pushing cable, especially analog lines, can get expensive when you're working with traditional POTS. You'd no longer have to worry about that. Buying a DID is way cheaper than buying a single analog line any day, all day. It doesn't matter what company you're working with. It's cheaper to go with VoIP. And when we can implement these solutions that are very scalable, very affordable, and we can have a centralized way of communicating, that means your customer can spend more time delegating these resources to, improving, their work environment, paying their employees more, investing more into their company, buying other products, and, just investing in general. So when they're not having to spend that much money on being able to call their customers, they can spend it where it counts. When you're working with our unified communication solutions, you can serve customers better. You can, on the fly, log into any of our equipment, make changes per your customer's demand on what they need in that moment or what they need to have done on their system. Very easily, we can connect anyone throughout the world using our unified communication solutions, which allows your customers to be more productive because now they have all this added flexibility on how they can get not only talking to you, but also talking to what's important, which is their customers as well. Because more than likely, we're not just installing these for houses, but we're also predominantly going to be attacking the SMB market all the way up to enterprise market. Another thing too, VoIP is very secure for the most part as long as you know what you're doing. We can implement security protocols which will encrypt our RTP or our audio. We can even implement security as far as signaling on SIP as well. So you're not going to have to worry about any pesky listening of people who may not or should not be listening to what's going on in a certain customer location. And another advantage too, you can work from anywhere. With the UC solutions, if you're out of the office, we can be using GS Wave in order to have their customers contact them. If they're across the country and they want to do a conference with one of our video phones, we can make sure that they are there as if they were in that office. So in general, we got you covered to make not only yours but your customer's life much easier. The method of communication definitely makes a difference. As you can see, a little web of all of our products that we are currently supporting. We have our analog gateways, which is to the bottom right a little bit. We have our smaller ATAs or our gateways that's in mid 12 o'clock on this screen. We also have UCM, video phones, audio and video conferencing, as well as access control units like our GDS there. But in general, as your customer's business expands, we can do what we need to get them able to communicate with their customer. So we don't have to be stuck with just phone calls. We can go beyond that. Video conferencing, access control, and so forth. Components of communication. Obviously, it's not the day and age of the old smoke signals anymore. We can now communicate through some pretty cool technology, phones, over the internet, through video, email, and instant message. With the advent of technology, different forms of communication has developed, whether it is verbal communication or nonverbal using, applications like Microsoft and so forth. But in general, the methods in which we communicate have become more advanced, and they're always changing, and they're getting better and even more affordable. With communication as our focus, we have done very well for ourselves with over 100 plus direct distributors and thousands of authorized resellers worldwide, we have been able to provide solutions for our market for quite some time. We are the leading manufacturer in low to mid density VoIP analog gateways, leading open source IP-PBX manufacturer in the SMB market. We are the top 2 video phone manufacturer, top 3 SIP IP phone manufacturer as well. So with communication as our key focus, you know we gotcha. With a mission statement of connecting the world, obviously we have a comprehensive portfolio of covering your UC solutions, whether it's your desktop IP phones, video phones, cordless DEC IP phones, soft phones, video and audio conferencing systems, cloud-based conferencing services such as IP Video Talk, our open source asterisk-based IP PBX for both SMBs and enterprise solutions. Voice and video optimization through a smart and secure networking infrastructure like our GWN 7000, which is our router and access point. SIP security cameras and access control systems such as our GDS, which allows you to keep things covered and keep your eyes open. As well as even, taking old existing technologies, and I'm not talking about smoke signals here, I'm talking about analog lines, 1 to 48 port gateways for your analog termination, such as FXS to FXO termination. We can take both POTS and analog phones and send them over IP. That way you can still take advantage of an affordable solution for even some of your older technology. What is the UCM series? Obviously, our UCM is our PBX, which gives you enterprise-grade features for an affordable, compact, and quite an easy-to-manage form factor. The PBX shown here is designed specifically for SMB and enterprise market solutions. A really good and good selling point of our products is no licensing fees. When you buy our equipment, you buy it fully functioning. You don't need to buy any extra license to get analog lines or some VoIP trunk working. We don't do that here. You buy our equipment, you have the full range and flexibility on what it can do. Super easy to set up. If you're really skilled like myself, I can get one set up within 30 minutes and have a happy customer by the end of the day. Really easy to manage as well with features like zero config on our PBX, which allows us to push configurations out to phones. It makes programming a dream. As well as all hardware and software is included, and as well as lifetime firmware updates. The cool thing with our firmware updates is obviously we're constantly adding cool new features to every firmware revision, so stay up to date on that firmware and you'll always have something cool to show your clients that will make their life easier. Our UCM components, I think this is basically bare bones. If I was actually going to put up all the features on here, I don't think we could fit it on one PowerPoint, but for the ones that are important to businesses, we are going to support VoIP. Obviously, it's a PBX. It's going to be high quality and reliable communication over our VoIP connections. We have full codec support, voice features and customizations within different features and services that our UCM provides, call recording, CDR reporting. We even do codecs transcoding, so if one provider is using some set codec, we can actually transcode both between VoIP trunks and different endpoints. System backups. We recently implemented NAS for both call recording backups as well as a system backup for a TFTP server to upload our config on. Voicemail and fax to email, and we can do those both in conjunction where you have voicemail go to an extension or that voicemail gets sent over to an email, which is a very handy feature. LDAP phone book, so we can make sure anyone who's connected as a SIP endpoint to our system will have the advantage of having LDAP phone book being pushed to whatever unit that they're using. The mobility aspect of our system as well. We have our soft phone applications like GS Wave. We could remotely monitor our system through the system's dashboards. multiple office connections too. Like I said before, you could support a multi-business tenant off of one UCM, or you can have different locations separated by their own UCM for redundancy and for failover, and we could interconnect these UCMs together. Another thing as well, obviously, if we're going to do audio, we have to do video, especially for conferencing. But we're going to do SIP video, surveillance integration, and video codec support as well. So we support many of the common ones like H.264 and so forth. Up next, we have UCM specifications. If you have the chance, go ahead and take a screenshot of this page. It is very helpful, and there are a couple key components I want you to note down if you could. But we offer something called power failover, but that's only available for 6510. And all the power failover does is, let's say your UCM loses power, you can still call out using the FXS ports on the 6510. So if you plug an analog phone in there, you will be able to access your analog lines using the 6510. The next thing I want you to pay attention to is which units are rack mountable. So currently the 62 or the 6108, 6116, 6216, and the 6510s are all rack mountable. But just know if our UCM has more than 8 FXO ports, it's going to be rack mountable. And just also take note of how many FXS ports and FXO ports each model has. Obviously, the last number of the model number is in reference to how many FXO ports, so keep that in mind when you're taking the test. And I still hope you have your cameras out and print screen buttons ready. This is another slide that's very imperative that you have and is very interesting to at least keep with you. Just make a note on which ones are going to support what type of loads, how many users is the UCM going to support. Like I said before, 61 series, our old hardware revision, can only do 500 users, 62 800, and our 6510 up to 2,000 users. Concurrent call is definitely something I think I remember being an interesting point on the test, as well as what UCM supports the E1T1 interface. Obviously, that's only the 6510 that supports that. But beyond that, a lot of this information is self-explanatory. I definitely recommend if you get anything from this, you take this with you, because you will have customers ask you, well, here's how big my business is, what do I need? And this little chart here will tell you exactly what you need to give them to, give them whatever solution that they need. And here's GS Wave. It works for both Android and iOS mobile soft phones. It is a free and powerful tool which allows you and your customers to work remotely from anywhere in the world as long as they have a cell phone connection. It allows you to register up to 6 accounts per cell phone. Do 6-way voice conferencing, as well as giving you 24 virtual BLF keys, 2-way video calls, and a lot more to go with that. It's also capable of integrating with any IP PBX. Doesn't have to be ours, but it will work absolutely amazing with our 61 series, 2 and 6510 series PBX. Which allows you and your customer to have a more powerful tool than their competitors. Diving deeper into GS Wave, at the top you can see the available codecs for you to use. Some of the information is redundant. I'm not going to go over that with the 6-way audio conferencing. We can do SIP over TLS and secure our audio with SRTP. We also have the ability to send out QR codes for any client that wants to register using GS Wave. As soon as they open up the app, they could input their QR code, which will immediately register their GS Wave application with your UCM. which makes both you and your customer's life much easier. And as you're taking a call, you can switch between Bluetooth, earphone speaker, and 3.5 millimeter headset jack. Two-way video call is supported with the H.264 video codec, so just keep that in mind if you want to do two-way video calls. Really fun if you use our GDS, our video door system, and we are calling GS Wave. You can answer it through video, see who's on the other side of that unit, and be able to open the door all using GS Wave. So in all, it's a really cool feature, and it's something that, it being a free application, you'll have a lot of fun with. Up next, we have GS Affinity, which is a proprietary application that will run on your customer's desktop, which allows them to manage calls coming to and from their phone all through the application, so they don't actually have to reach over to their phone, dial anything. They could all do it from their computer. So this was very popular with any help desk scenario that you might need or your customers might need. But keep in mind that this is a proprietary application, and just take a brief note of what phones that GS Affinity is compatible with. This is going to be a very interesting topic, but just know that the GXP 1700 and the GXP 2100 series is compatible with GS Affinity. But as well as keeping that in mind, just know you can see call logs and get information about any connected phone. And we also have some handy syslog tools and diagnostics that will run natively on this application. Just keep a note of all the actions that you're allowed to do. This will be something I'm pretty sure is going to be up on your test. But just know, initiate, accept calls from this application is something that you can do. You can unhold or put people on hold and unhold from it, transfer calls like I had mentioned before. Set D&D, mute, phone book management stuff I've already went with you on the first slide, but make sure you keep all this in mind for that test. With Grandstream, building your integrated communication network could not be easier. With our UCM, it does come with a cool feature set of tools which allows us to actually configure these devices without actually needing to be on site. So with the help of Zero Config, we can actually communicate with every device on this network and push out configuration updates to it. Not only you as an administrator can manage the network, but also your users can manage their workflow as well using their user portal. Not only can you check the status of devices using the dashboard or the extensions page, but your users will also have the ability to log in and manage a lot of their personal account information, such as how their extensions are going to be forwarding, what type of calls that they take. They could even manage their CDR and call recording information directly from their user portal. So you can actually grant or restrict access to their user if you want, but for the most part, a lot of users like being able to log into the UCM and control how calls are going to go in and out from their extension. Up next, we're going to be talking about the physical interface and the LCD screen of the UCM. So you can get a lot of informational stuff just based upon the LCD screen. You can find the web access information, and this is a very important note, directly from the LCD screen menu. So if you don't know what IP and port it's currently set as, in our default access port is 8089, just note that you can find IP and port information on how to access the device directly through the LCD screen menu. Another thing that you also want to check as well is what type of information you can get from the LCD screen. And one very important thing to note is predominantly you are going to be getting the device's status, whether it's actually currently running in normal operation, and 2, network information for the UCM. But we also have options of factory resetting all through the LCD screen. as well as changing some network aspects, like whether we are in a statically allocated mode on our IP or a dynamic, or using DHCP to get a IP lease to our UCM. Our UCM does have a built-in web server. That's why when you hit its IP address, it gives you this nice, cool-looking web page. But there are a couple different methods that we can use to access the UCM. One, if you just plug an Ethernet cable into the WAN port and have that plugged into a switch or router that is leasing DHCP, it will pick up an IP address, and you could verify what that is from the LCD screen and log into its access port. Now, you could just hit in the IP address, and the UCM should redirect you to the https:// and put the IP plus the :8089 after that. You do have the option to disable the redirection if you want for extra security, but typically use https:// the IP address on the LCD screen, then :8089 on your URL bar of your web browser. The other option is connecting directly through the LAN port on the UCM, because by default it is running DHCP services through that LAN port. So if you plug in, your computer will immediately pick up an IP, and which point you could hit it at the default address of 192.168.2.1. So we do have two options there for you to access that UCM. But beyond that, it should be as easy as that, and you want to check out what the passwords are. If you have an older unit like our 61 series, it was admin, but with some of our newer models that we came out with, we wanted to add to the security by doing a burned in address. So if you look at the very bottom of your UCM, right where you can read the MAC address information, you should see a default or pre-burned in password on that you can use to log in. Another cool handy feature of the UCM is the setup wizard. This is a nice feature to have because it allows you to set up all the important or the imperative stuff first, like changing your password, which I know all of you should be good at by now. Editing your network settings, selecting what time zone you're coming from. Obviously, you're not going to have very good, accurate inbound routing with time conditions if you don't have your time set properly on the UCM in the first place. You can then create extensions and do your trunks and start doing routing as well. And by the time you get to your summary, you should have a functional system in which you can fine-tune per your customer's choice from there. Now, I know we briefly talked about zero config, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper on what zero config is. This is a helpful management tool that is on our UCM. It will only work via the LAN port, so if you are considering plugging this into your customer's network, we might have to change the network settings on there so that we disable the DHCP service that will run natively on that LAN port. So keep that in mind. The UCM can provision phones beyond just SIP account information. So as you can see smack dab in the middle of that picture, we have that 2170 there, and we have that account information which we can enable and assign it an extension. Our zero config can do more than that as far as going to MPKs, and let's say we don't have a configuration option on zero config itself. We do have the added option of creating model templates or global templates and adding p-values into those templates, which you can get from our website in our configuration templates. But the configuration template in a nutshell has a bunch of p-values on it, which each p-value is going to represent a certain configuration option on our endpoints, regardless of what type of endpoint it is, a phone, conferencing system. Then from there you can associate that p-value with a string or predetermined configuration option, and we can actually add those entries onto the UCM. And once you have them in there, it's up to you on how you want to provision and configure your customer's phone. But in a nutshell, zero config will make your life easier. You don't actually have to always be connected into these phones to make changes. You can make the changes directly through the UCM, and you could either make an individual change per phone or make a change to a model template that will change all phones at once. So it's pretty helpful. Now there's a couple way endpoints will be able to interact with our UCM. First of them is through a SIP subscribe message where an endpoint will be sending subscription messages to our UCM to see if there is any updates, whether it's regarding BLFs or just its config in general. The other alternative is the MDNS option, and also option 66, but this will only apply in router mode. So really cool feature. Option 66 gives the UCM the ability that if a phone boots up on a network not having a config whatsoever, and we have our UCM in its DHCP leasing mode through the LAN port, as soon as we lease that an IP address, we will also be changing information on what firmware source it has and what the configuration source should be for that phone. But just note, you will have to make sure you add these phones on zero config before that is a possibility. And here is the zero config settings. From this page on the zero config settings, it will allow you to either enable or disable zero config, so you have that choice whether you want it enabled or not. We can also enable auto assign extensions. Now, unfortunately, I don't see this one being used a lot, just because a lot of customers already have extensions that they once had that they want on the new system. So this might not be so popular to use, but maybe on a new installation where a brand new business is opening up, they've never had extensions whatsoever, so they don't have that pre-initial bias. You could enable the auto assignment extension, and any phone that comes up and gets connected through the UCM zero config will immediately be assigned an extension automatically, as well as having an option for pick extensions too. So let's say you know what your customer's extension range is, and you create that range on the UCM, but you want to give the option for your customers to choose what extension that they want. If you enable the pick extension, a little message will be sent to that phone, and as soon as your customers see it come up, they will be able to choose what extension that they want to use, and as soon as they select it, the UCM will go from there and assign them that extension that they have chosen. So it's all in the name of making your life easier, as well as the flexible network segments of whitelist. So we can do whitelisting in here. And we can, I think, do up to 5 whitelists if I'm not mistaken. But in the network whitelist, this is what you'll also be using to whitelist other VLANs. So like I said before, we cannot provision out to the network, but we can provision on the local network that may be separated using VLANs. If you add that VLAN there in the subnet notation, we will be able to provision another device on a different VLAN. So let's say we plug in a phone to the network, but unfortunately we do not get an automatic discovery of a SIP endpoint. We do have the added option of pinging ARP or sending a SIP message to the IP address of that phone, just so we can get the device model number and firmware revision on there. Once we have that information, we are then allowed to configure that SIP endpoint with whatever information that we want. Keep in mind, and here is an interesting note that I'd like for you to write down. Zero config will allow the administrator to reboot phones, discover phones in the network, as well as push out device configuration. So keep those 3 things in mind, and just know that zero config will be your best friend, especially when it comes to remotely managing all your SIP endpoints through the UCM. Now, just note, I did mention earlier a couple templates. Now, there is a hierarchy at play here. Global template will take precedence over all the other templates. Then there will follow global policy, model configuration. Then last but not least, we have the device configuration, in which, as long as you're connected directly and locally to that UCM, you can access the web page of an endpoint through the UCM or just by connecting to it locally. It's completely up to you, but there will be a hierarchy at play on what template will take precedence over another. The global configuration I know we briefly discussed templates, but in global configuration, that's where you're going to make most of your general configuration options, regardless of what the SIP endpoint is. But this will allow you to set pretty common settings like time, language, where to pull firmware updates from. Stuff like that's really good for the global configuration, because they're more likely going to apply to all devices in the first place. So if you have something that's going to be generally set amongst not just a model of device, but all devices in particular, like language or time, obviously, you will be setting it here. But just note, global templates will have a higher priority than the global policy, meaning that if we have the exact same setting in both of them, templates will take that setting over the policy. So if I have, NTP set to one setting on the global templates, and I have that very same setting but different on the global policy, it will take the template one over the policy any time of the day. So keep that in mind when you are using the global or the global policy options in zero config. Just note which one will take precedence over the other. Very easily could be a question on this as well, so pay very close attention. Now, the cool thing about using templates is you can create as many templates as you want, and each template could have its own template name and description on what that does, and you can add or subtract this template to the configuration of either one or multiple SIP endpoints that are being configured through zero config. As you can see, per my previous example, in the phone settings, we have some pretty general settings in there, like what the dial plan should be, enable certain call features. Are we going to use pound as a dial key? I mean, this is very common amongst all of our products, like our phones, like our gateways and everything else. You will see a lot of these same settings within those models, regardless how different they may be. Now here's our global policy. This is going to be more general settings for any SIP endpoint that's connected through zero config. As you can see, we can change things like contact list, localizations, maintenance, network settings, and even customize certain LCD screens and wallpapers that may be on the certain SIP endpoint. So anytime you put one of these configuration options in global policy, you can then add that to your phones, at which point they will get configured with these more generalized options. I would definitely recommend using this. Like I said, if you have a lot of different models that you're zero configuring, but you want them to have the same option, like allow DHCP option 483 and 66 to override the DHCP server, that's something that you might want to be set to no, especially if you're going to be updating firmware from something outside the network that's not local to the UCM. So in general, you're going to be using the global templates and global policy for the more generalized settings between unlike devices. All right, in this section we're going to be talking about the model configuration. It's pretty straightforward and specific to what it does. You can create a template based upon its model, like the GXV3240. Now here is a good example that I had mentioned prior. Let's say you couldn't find a setting in one of the predetermined options, like MPK1. Let's say we didn't have that. We have the customized field where you can add your configuration template p-values and whatever value, string, or predetermined set option you can add there. So if you're not finding something within zero config, you can always add it as a p-value. But beyond that, let's say we did have a MPK1 setting, which we do. We can create that setting as a speed dial, set it to the account that we want, and put the information that is needed into there, save and apply that change, and we can either go into each phone and add it manually, or you can enable the default model template and they'll get applied to every model regardless. if you want to add it to it or not. It will immediately be added. You won't have to manually go and add it to that phone, which makes things a little bit easier, but you might want to be careful with that, especially if you don't want certain settings to be amongst all phones. You might not even want to touch it. Device configuration. Now, there is two ways that we could technically do this. If you look at the top right hand corner, you can see we can choose what phone that we want to edit. So let's take, for example, that GXP 2160. We're going to be clicking on that icon with the little pin in the little box there. That will allow you to edit the phone as you see here below, and make individual configuration changes to that phone. But you also have the added option if we go just further to the right. It looks like a little navigation compass or the Safari icon. I'm not too sure what you would associate that with. But if you click on that, that will give you that web access like I talked about beforehand. But remember, it's only going to work if you're already connected locally to that network. And then and only then it will allow you to open up the web interface through the UCM's interface. But typically, I just like to log into the phones anyways at that point. Oh, and just add a few notes here as well. There on the right hand side you can see model templates and global templates fields there. That's where you're going to add the templates in the available. So you're going to click on that little button that will have a little drop down for all the available model or global templates. You can then select that template and push the plus sign, which then will put into the selected category. And if it's part of that selected category, you can ensure that that is going to be configuration options that will be pushed out to that phone. Last but not least, once we are done with configuring through zero config and we want to actually update the phones with our new configuration changes, back to that former slide as where you can see where you can edit it and access the web page. This little cloud icon is also there, and when you click on that, it will send a notify to that endpoint and telling it to update because it has a new config for itself. You technically don't need to push the notify because the phone will check by default so many X amount of minutes or so. So either you're going to update it by pushing that update through the UCM, or allow that phone to either reboot or update itself after so many minutes. But once you do that, it's one and done. You're good to go, and you can ensure that that endpoint is configured. And last but not least, we also have the ability to reboot SIP endpoints on the UCM. So all you have to do is click on that power button icon. It will actually reboot your SIP endpoints, and if whatever configuration change is needed, it will take place after that reboot. Oftentimes I'll use this for firmware updates. So if I make a configuration change to update the firmware server path, I could even set the firmware server path to point to our UCM, and you can actually host firmware on the UCM itself. But once you do that, you can go ahead and actually hit the reboot button for that SIP endpoint after it reboots. It'll be good to go to take both the config and start updating its firmware. Now, I know I mentioned QR codes earlier, but I didn't go into detail on how they necessarily worked. This is my opportunity. So it's pretty straightforward. If you create an extension on the UCM, there is the option within the extension to add the customer's email address. Once you put their email address in there, save and apply changes, you can look at the extension page as is, and you should see that little mail time icon there. Once you click on that, it will send a QR code information to their email, at which point they can log into their email using their phone, grab the QR code, upload it to GS Wave, and right then and there they can start making outbound and inbound calls and start doing what they have to do. So pretty straightforward and easy to set up. Just know if you don't first set up your email settings on your PBX, this might be a little tough to do, but usually the default settings will allow you to do this immediately. It all depends on how you have the UCM set up, but for the most part, this is how you'll register most of your customers using GS Wave. And for our next section, call management. Now, in this section, we're going to be mainly talking about how users are going to be managing calls through their SIP endpoints. With that being said, let's go ahead and dive in. One of the call management options here is SIP forking. Now, this isn't technically management from the user end, but it is a form of how endpoints will register to our PBX. Now, the cool thing about SIP forking in general is it allows you to have multiple registered endpoints to a single extension. As you can see per our example, we have 3 endpoints here. One is a home phone, the other is a GS Wave, and we have a desk phone, all registered to 1000. Now, here is an interesting point. You can only register up to 10 endpoints per extension. So keep that in mind. You can only register 10 endpoints per extension. So I'll only be able to register 10 endpoints to extension 1000. Now obviously we have 3 here, but this is a very nice handy feature for a lot of solutions where someone might want to receive a call throughout the day on different endpoints. Maybe they want it to ring on their phone as well as their cell phone and their office phone as well. That way they can always stay in touch no matter where they're at in a geographic location. Next, we have call transfer. Now we have 3 supported methods here, or 3 transfer types. The first one would be blind transfer, which allows an individual to transfer a call without even notifying the recipient of that transfer. This is typically what I see a favored solution. Next best after that is going to be your attended transfer. I see this used a lot. A lot of people will often go with a call park solution instead of doing attended transfer. But we'll do with whatever your customers feel most comfortable with. But in the attended transfer scenario, I, receiving a call, will take that call and say, ooh, who do you need to speak with? Okay, you need to speak with Tim. Give me 1 second. I can then put that person on hold. I could then call Tim on my next free account. And as I talk to Tim, relaying him the information on who's called in, I can then converge the calls together. And as I'm staying on that call, and I can have Tim talk to the customer I just talked with as I'm staying on that line. As soon as I hang up my call, they will stay connected together and I can drop off the line. The other option that we have, and this is more for preference of how transfers sound for more or less of anything, but when you use seamless transfer, you can transfer someone without giving music on hold or giving them the ring back tone as default. It'll immediately just transfer that person to that call and connect them. Next, we have Do Not Disturb and Do Not Disturb whitelist. For most of everyone knows what Do Not Disturb is. Basically, if you enable this option, it will allow that extension not to receive any calls at that time and often reject those calls as soon as they hit us. The other alternative too is the Do Not Disturb whitelist. So there's going to be times in which customers want to not take calls, but at the same time take the important ones. So we can actually create whitelist for certain numbers or extensions in which when you call that person, if you're part of that whitelist, you'll still be able to ring that person even though that they're in a Do Not Disturb state. Now, another call feature that you will use probably on a daily basis, both you and your customers, is our call forwarding option. Now, call forwarding can be enabled on the extension or through the UCM's web UI. It's a really fun feature which allows you to, direct calls with call forwarding and allow them to go to certain destinations like other internal services or extensions on the UCM, as well as maybe external numbers if you want. But if we enable call forwarding, we do have 3 different methods. One is going to be call forward unconditional, which it will unconditionally call forward to whatever value that you put in the forwarding statement. We also will support call forwarding when that person is busy. Now, how do you determine if someone's busy? Simple. They just hit rejection when they're receiving a call, which then you can send to an alternate destination if you want. And there's also call forwarding no answer. Now, this part will, on some levels, wipe out voicemail. I mean, you won't get voicemail if you do call forwarding with no answer and you have that enabled, so just be aware of that. But it's simply if you just don't answer your phone call, it just kept ringing and ringing and it finally timed out. So instead of going to voicemail, you can forward that to an alternate destination, like maybe a voicemail group or a ring group, or back to maybe, let's say, the receptionist at this office. So one thing I don't think is mentioned in this section, but we also have time conditions in which users can use these call forwarding options. So keep that in mind. Not only can we do call forwarding, but we can say when you can or can't do call forwarding as well. And as always, we have a call forwarding whitelist. So if we do have some important extensions like the CEO wanted to call someone who enabled one of these options, it will still ring through onto their phone. So our next feature we have is on hold, or putting calls on hold. This is a pretty universal feature with any PBX system out there. I think one of the big differences with ours is you can actually upload MP3 files and they will be converted for you into a .wav format. Or if you have an audio file that is already .wav format, you can also upload that. As long as you're not exceeding how many megabytes that audio file is, you'll be good. One of the other alternatives as well is actually creating a custom prompt that will actually call your extension, and as you pick it up, it'll tell you to speak loudly and clearly, at which point you can then record your own audio. And this is helpful, especially in the music on hold or in the custom prompt section, which will allow you to take those custom prompts and upload them to any call feature that is available to take those prompt files for itself and actually use it. So like IVRs, ring groups that will also have custom prompts before they play into ring groups, and so forth. But for the most part, standard feature. I'm pretty sure most of you already know what this will do. I don't think we have any special questions on that, so that's something you won't have to worry about. Next feature we have is call parking. Now, to be biased, this is one of my favorite features. I don't know why. I just like parking people on calls and being able to retrieve them from anywhere on that system. But a simple breakdown of what the call park feature does is if you're talking with anyone, you can put someone on a hold, or I guess a parked hold, where you send that person to a designated extension. On a default UCM, your parking valet is 700, and 701 through 720, those extensions are reserved for the parking lots. So you can park someone at 700, which 700, the technical valet, will then park that person at one of the available lots, 701 through 720. Obviously, like a good valet, he will park them on the first spot and not bother moving anywhere randomly. So always park that call on the first spot available, which is typically going to be 701. From there, anyone throughout the office can dial that number of 701 to retrieve that person. Now, you can expand the number of parking lots if you want. It's not something that I often do too often, but every once in a while a customer might need that, depending upon how much they use parking lots in a given scenario. But for the most part, I would say my favorite method of using the parking lots is using an MPK that's configured with Monitor Call Park. So Monitor Call Park gives you that added advantage of having a one-touch solution. So if I set a Monitor Call Park key and I have it set to 701, if I click that key while I'm on call with someone, it will park that person. Now, if you ever set this up by yourself and you just want to test to make sure it was working, you don't technically have to be on a call with someone in order to test it. You can just press that MPK and you should immediately get a hold music. And that's how you can tell that you're currently both parked and that feature is currently working. But for the most part, this is a very, very common feature to use because a lot of people like that one-touch solution, or they just like to park a call and pick it up from wherever in the office. Now, I probably spoke too soon about call parking being my favorite. I would have to say messing with outbound and inbound routes is probably the first, to be quite honest. We'll knock down parking at second. Let's just say that. But for right now, we're looking at outbound routes, and there are a couple important things that we have to talk about when concerning ourselves with outbound routes. One is the dialed pattern. Now, the dialed pattern is going to be represented in a pattern notation. Now, you can go to our documents to look at what the available patterns are, but typically it's going to be X and N if you want. I prefer using just X's, and X is a value that's equal to anything 0 through 9. So as long as you do 7 X's, 10 and 11 X's, that will constitute for a 7, 10, and 11 digit dialing. And if you put that pattern on an outbound route, you're basically good to route calls outward. Obviously, there's a couple other things that we have to mention, like stripping and prepending digits too. That is a very handy feature, especially if we're working with analog lines and your customers are too lazy to put in the one and the area code like most analog providers like. So oftentimes we'll use a prepend in order to prepend the one in their area code, so that if they want to just hit 7 digits and be able to dial out, they could do that. Strip is basically the same concept in reverse. So instead of adding things, we'll actually strip the character off before sending it. So you could think of it like this. If we are setting up a rule in which we're using both strip and prepend, just know that the stripping will always come first, but then we'll prepend after. So just make a quick note of that. Stripping will always come first before you prepend something. We also have failover as well. So let's say we try to create an outbound route, but then that trunk or median, like an analog line, is not available because it went down for some odd reason. Well, if we add or use a failover trunk, it will actually use that alternate trunk if the first one is down. That will give you a good case use for redundancy. Another one is going to be privilege / permission level. Now, there's a couple ways that you can use permission level. There's going to be 2 ways that you can verify someone's permission. When you first create that extension on the general page, as soon as you click or even open, or if you make a new extension or edit an existing one, you'll see permission level directly on that page. And there is the system of internal, local, national, and international. Obviously, internal is the lowest permission level, and international is the highest permission level. Take a note of that. It's something that might be on the test. If you know what that is on your extension, you can set whatever permission level you want on your outbound route. But don't let that naming scheme fool you, because you can give an extension an internal permission level, but if your outbound route pattern matches 7, 10, and 11 digit, and on that outbound route you also have it set to internal, an internal permission level still is allowing that person to dial on a trunk 7, 10, and 11 digit numbers. So it really has no bearing on what they're allowed to dial. The permission level in conjunction with what you put as your pattern on your outbound route is what gives you that permission level. So if I wanted to restrict someone from dialing internationally, I can use an international code of 011, then followed by how many numerical X's after that I need for international calling, and I can have the permission level be set to disable, and that is an extra option which will forbid anyone who dials that matching pattern. If their privilege level is disabled, and that means it will basically not even route the call and reject it right then and there. Another way we can control permission level as well is by enable filter on the source caller ID. If you have that enable, one thing that probably will alarm you immediately is you see that your privilege level goes from whatever it's currently set to disable. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to route the calls. It just means it's using a different method besides privilege system in order to route that call. But once you enable filter on source caller ID, you can right then and there add what extensions you want to be able to use this outbound route. So right then and there, it makes being able to allow who's allowed to dial certain patterns a lot easier, because then you can just add the extension in there. And I tend to do that with some of my newer customers who are still getting familiar with this system. It's a lot easier to use in that fashion. And another interesting topic you should note down is users can restrict an outbound route to specific extensions. This can be done using the enable filter on source caller ID. Keep that in mind. We can also set call duration limits as well. So maybe we have a trunk that is pretty costly to call out on, and we don't want them going over so many minutes. We can actually put a time variable. A good example of when you might use this, maybe we do want people to call internationally, but we are going to charge them for that, and we don't want to get overcharged for a certain set duration limit. So you will have a pattern that matches an international number, then you'll set your call duration limit to whatever you want. So when they get close to that time, you can also set about how long of a warning beep you'll get before it disconnects the call. So within 30 seconds between it disconnecting, you'll give that warning beep, and that person should know that the system's basically going to hang up on them. Another way of authenticating yourself, let's say we don't want to do permission levels or privilege levels or enable filter source caller ID. We can actually enable pin groups, in which serves two functions. One, it will have anyone who tries to call out on that outbound route to authenticate themselves. It also gives you the ability to control what groups are allowed to call out. So when you create a pin group, you can put your desired extensions within that pin group. Let's call that pin group sales, marketing, whatever. You can give them a predetermined password on that pin group. That's what the pin group and pin group's all about. That's going to be the pin that you'll use in order to authenticate yourself to that outbound route to allow you to dial out. The advantage of this is if you set up pin groups, you know what group dialed out at what time and maybe racked up a huge international charge. So it gives you a little bit more of a hands-on approach to seeing who's calling at what time, and with the added benefit of being a little bit more secure. We can even add blacklist as well, so we can blacklist certain numbers from ever being dialed. For the most part, I rarely use the blacklist, but it is there for you to use. Maybe you want to blacklist certain numbers that you do not want to be dialed, like 411. But for the most part, I usually use the patterns to restrict what's going to be dialed out. We also have time conditions too, in which we can set certain time conditions on when we want to route or have calls being active at a certain time. And we also have an added feature called the DoD field. Now this technically isn't on outbound routes. This is also a feature that is on your trunk level. So if you edit a trunk, especially a VoIP trunk, and you edit your DoD field, you can associate certain extensions with a certain DoD number or a direct outward dialing number. And that comes in handy because maybe you have a CEO's extension who wants his own special DID to be shown when he dials outwardly. Well, that is a feature for you to use. So when you edit the DoD, you add his extension to the DoD, followed by his desired DoD number. So whenever he calls out a certain VoIP trunk, that prepended DoD number will also follow him, so that any user he contacts through the outside world could see that number and dial him back on that preferred DoD number. Next, we have inbound routes. This is a pretty straightforward feature, inbound route. It's self-explanatory. We're talking about routes that are coming from your trunk, being able to direct them to the appropriate destination using inbound routes. Now, there are a lot of things that are similar between inbound and outbound routes. They just function very differently. Obviously, one's going outward, the other one's coming inward. But they both have DIDs, and patterns that you can select from. The pattern that you're going to input, if you just wanted to test your trunk, you can use X period, and that will generally catch everything that comes your way. There are a couple cases in which certain VoIP providers might even put a plus in front of the DID pattern going to your system. That will leave you scratching your head, and has, for me, on many cases. So whenever I'm testing an inbound route, I will try two things. I'll do X period, and all period really does is it's saying any number after that I will accept. So if I put X, that means any number 0 through 9. I put period after that, so that means any number 0 through 9 will be allowed by 2 digits all the way up to infinite. So that's a pretty good way of just routing calls inward. But then I'll also put plus X period for those particular VoIP providers that like to send DIDs with pluses on them. Not a lot of them do that, but some will, and it will leave you scratching your head unless you're running a capture and you can see that incoming to header being sent with that plus number. With the inbound route, you also are able to select what trunk you are referencing when you're creating an inbound route. So you can switch between analog and your SIP trunk right on the page of when you edit it. So even if you currently edited an existing inbound route for an analog trunk, you can just switch that over to analog, SIP, whatever you need to, PRI. But as far as patterns go, in conjunction with a certain trunk, obviously with every trunk you might be expected to see certain patterns to come through. Obviously your customer might have a main number, so you can specify that main number on your pattern, like 909-555-1234, and that will route to the receptionist's phone and ring groups. But with the default destination, that's where you're actually going to select who the destination is going to be. This could be an IVR, extensions, ring groups, voicemail, fax, almost whatever you want, even external numbers. Not everything in our default destination is put up here on this slide, but we have many options for you to choose from. And you can get really creative with creating dummy extensions that will have unconditional call forwarding for the more advanced setups, but we're really flexible on what we allow you to do. And as before in outbound routes, we have stripping and prepending, but this is going to work inverse. So we can strip the first value on any pattern that's being dialed inward from your provider, or we could even prepend it with some extra characters. Oftentimes I don't use stripping and prepending a lot on inbound routes, but it can be very handy if you want to route certain calls to certain extensions. Let's say we want to match an extension off the main number, and we're only going to reference the last 4 digits of that main number, like 1, 2, 3, 4. So we can actually strip the first 3 values off of that direct inward dialing number, and we'll only be looking at the last 4, and we'll route that last 4 by DID to whatever extension that we create that matches that DID of 1, 2, 3, 4. We also have the advantage of blacklisting caller ID as well, so we can blacklist certain caller IDs from even hitting our inbound routes. You can even create different modes as well. So we have something called inbound multiple modes on inbound routes, and all this really does is you have 2 modes, a default mode and mode 1, as you can see with the picture to the right. Now default mode is going to be where it's going to go no matter what, but mode 1 is something that you can switch to, and by editing your inbound multiple mode feature codes, you can select what you want to have to switch those. But predominantly, if your customer on the fly wants to change routing on a particular inbound route, they can switch from default mode to mode 1, and mode 1 could be maybe their night IVR or their night voicemail. So this will actually give your customers the ability to switch inbound routes to another destination on the PBX. That's a pretty popular one that I see commonly used with a lot of my customers, and something that you'll have a lot of fun playing with. But just know you only have two options: default mode, which will route to whatever you set for the default destination, and the routing for mode 1. That's going to be your second option that you have there. We also have the advantage of creating time conditions as well. So maybe we want to route calls during certain times of the day. So during their lunch break, we'll route it to another office that's maybe located on the East Coast that can take the calls during that time that maybe West Coast is out at lunch. Time conditions will allow you to do that. And one thing I also forgot to mention is that we can discriminate on calls not only by caller ID, through blacklisting, but if we put in a caller ID pattern that we want to match, like let's say the CEO's wife, if we know what her caller ID is for a cell phone, we can input that and make sure that her phone call will go directly to his extension or his voicemail. That way she can leave an emergency message if she has to. But beyond that, that's the majority of inbound routes that you'll need to know. I think one thing I kind of left out was alert info, which is technically more of an advanced feature, but the alert info will allow you to change ringtone, and I think this will be noted on the test potentially. So watch out for that. If you have a question on what alert info does, just think of it being able to change ringtones for you. And all it really does is, let's say we enable alert info on an inbound route, a alert info a header will get stamped onto that, and if a phone receives that, and if you configure that phone to look out for that string that you have inputted there, you can tell it to ring differently. So you could actually differentiate certain trunks by the way they ring. And if you're up to date on our latest firmware with our phones, we went from having the option of 3 ringtones to I think 10 now. So we have added more flexibility with the new feature updates on our phones. Now here are some of the UC features. Now I'm not going to go through all these features on this one slide because we're going to go to each one and we're going to explain it individually. But here, if you want to take a print screen of this to see what some of the features are on the PBX, these are just common features that most customers will use on a daily basis when servicing a customer who's calling in onto their system. But we're going to go over each one for you and explain what they do. Next feature we have is our IVR. And our IVR, you could also call it an automated attendant, but all it really does is it gives you the option to do pre-recorded voice messages on this IVR that will then direct customers to press certain key events like 1 # 9, whatever it is. And you can then program those keys to go to a special function or feature on the UCM like extensions, departments, or operators. And I would recommend writing that down: extensions, departments, and operators. This is a very, very common, I think most of all the UCMs that I've ever installed, I've always set up IVRs on them. It's very popular. A lot of companies just like the ability to route their customers without actually having to pick up and see what they need. This will save you a lot of time when it comes to call routing because you're not the one having to actually route the customers. They're doing that for themselves. Another interesting point to mention is an IVR can go 5 levels deep. That means that when you are answered by an IVR, you have the option to dial another IVR up to 5 times. After the 5th time, I wouldn't try to go beyond that for reliability's sake. But for the most part, we're only going to support going 5 levels deep into an IVR, so you can route an IVR into an IVR up to 5 times. Yep, but you have your submenus, your key pressing events, and let's say someone is having issues with the IVR, they're not able to press buttons, or they're not able to understand or hear the operator. We also have 2 other options, which is which is in the IVR, which allows you to route any user that may have trouble to an operator extension. So if they can't press 0 for some reason, we have timeouts built on the key pressing events, which you can program on the IVR. And after that time is met, it will immediately send them to an extension. So that will give you some added backup if something does go wrong on an IVR. But beyond that, that's going to be IVR in a nutshell. Like I said before, these IVRs will make you and your employees' life much easier when the customer can route themselves. Here are some of the available options for key pressing events. Take a print screen of this if you can. I guarantee it will help you. But there is all the available call features that an IVR can route to, including external numbers or an extension. And let's say you didn't have one of these options. You can always create a dummy extension that's not registered with an unconditional call forwarding, and you can get to another call feature that might not be listed. It's a little bit more of a trick and tip for you, but that's something that you can have as an option if, let's say, you don't like any of the options available to you. But for the most part, we got everything covered. Another very handy feature and something that is a must with automated attendance or IVRs is the ability to whitelist and blacklist certain extensions. If for some reason we wanted to enable on that IVR the ability to call out on a trunk or call extensions, whatever it may be, we can add blacklist and whitelist. So we can make sure that if someone does dial an extension, we will make sure that they can only dial certain extensions and not the CEO's extension. So that is an option on the IVR and something that you can play around with. And this is probably something that you might want to check in with your customers as well, because who knows, they might be a little bit sensitive on what extensions are allowed to be dialing. Obviously, we have a camera in this example. I highly doubt, unless you're supporting H.264 on a VoIP trunk, someone with a video phone will be able to dial a camera and get the video stream, but you don't want them doing that in the first place, and we can stop that either by restricting a codec on a trunk or simply by using a blacklist on your IVR, preventing them from dialing maybe a camera extension. Another very popular option with our UCM series is conferencing. I think this is a mandatory and must for any PBX out there. But conferencing, it's pretty self-explanatory. I'm pretty sure most of you know this. But it allows multiple people to converge in on a single conference extension and be able to communicate with each other. There is a couple rules for conferencing that you might want to try, like public versus private mode. Public mode, which allows anyone, even outside callers, to dial into a conference and start a meeting right then and there. Audio is immediately available for you. The other option is private mode, which all it does is add passwords on there. Now with private mode, you can have two sets of password, one for regular users and the other for an administrator. Now the cool thing with the administrator option is that there's an option to allow no audio to be passed unless the admin extension gets in there. Obviously, the admin user password will be set maybe for the CEO. So the CEO sets up a conference on the UCM, mails it out to people. They all get ready for the conference. And by the way, you can even have the conference call out to people and call their extension for those who may forget. But as soon as that CEO enters the admin extension, we can allow the audio then to pass. You can also just keep it default to where the audio is passed no matter what, even if the administrator is not currently logged in. We could even have users invite external numbers or other extensions onto the conference. We can even announce callers as they come into the conference. I think for the most part, a lot of these are very common settings amongst other manufacturers and PBXs, but we have our own way of doing it, which is fun and entertaining. One thing to take note of is how many conference bridges you can have between the different series and models. This is a very interesting point here and something I would highly recommend taking a screenshot of if we haven't already in the previous. Max number of conference bridges is something that might get brought up. Max number of participants is also something that will get brought up as well. So before we finish up conference, let me go ahead and give you this helpful tip, or this quite interesting tip here. Distinctive ringtones do not apply in conference because the conference option does not have alert info as of yet. So keep that in mind when taking the test. And I'm pretty sure I mentioned this before in a previous slide, but conference bridging, that all that really is let's say we had two peered UCMs, we can actually interconnect their conference rooms together. And if once we do that, we can have a conference room from one UCM to be interconnected with the conference room of the other PBX on the other side. So this is something not done too often, but it is a very handy and helpful feature. And I do see a lot of larger businesses that have multi-locations. They'll constantly use this, and it is a really good selling feature for a lot of customers, having the ability to do conference bridging between multiple UCMs. Another fun feature with conferencing is scheduling. Really cool. I know I mentioned this before, but if you set this up with Google Calendars and you have it synced, anytime you create a conference on a set date, that will get pushed out through Google Calendar, so your company employees will see that someone had scheduled a conference for that set day. Just know you can also set the conference to actually dial extensions outward during that time as a reminder. But for the most part, setting up conferencing really makes things easy. You don't have to worry about constantly reminding everyone that they have a conference. They could simply look at their email or just get a random ring showing that there's a conference calling, and once they pick up, they'll be part of that conference. Next, we have voicemail management. Now, for the most part, probably self-explanatory. Voicemail management is very easy on our system. Not only can you manage voicemails locally if you're registered to an extension, with the help of the DISA option, you can actually dial into the system, get dial tone using DISA, and you can dial the a voicemail or remote voicemail code of *98 and that person's extension, at which point you'll authenticate yourself and you can edit and change your voicemail or even listen to voicemail using that menu. So we're pretty flexible on how you could manage your voicemail. You could dial someone's voicemail directly by hitting star and then their extension number. So let's say you don't want to talk to that person, but you want to leave them a really good nasty message. You can go ahead and just hit star their extension number and tell them whatever you need to say. We also have receiving voicemail to email. Pretty cool. Anytime you receive a voicemail, we have the added option to send that voicemail to an email. And this is going to be done all at the extension level. So if you edit someone's extension, obviously you make sure that you input their email on the email settings. And as soon as someone leaves a voicemail on that person's extension, a copy of that voicemail will be sent to their email. Another cool option is your users have the ability to manage their voicemail not only through their phone but through the web UI of the UCM. They could simply do this by using the username as their extension and authenticate themselves with their user password on their extension. Now this is much different than the password that is set to access your voicemail, but this is going to be same setting or in the same area. If you edit an extension, you'll see a user password which is already randomly generated, and you will have to edit that password either for them or by themselves by accessing their user portal. But once they do that, they can set that access password to whatever they want. And as for your interesting inquiry on this slide, keep in mind that you will be able to access your voicemail dialing the feature code *97, receiving via email like we mentioned before, and accessing voicemails through your user portal on the UCM. So keep those three things in mind when taking the test. Next we have pickup groups. Pickup groups is a secure way of allowing extensions to pick up ringing calls on a phone, and I can't stress that enough when I mention ringing. What this will do is if you have set extensions within the same pickup group, if a phone is ringing at a certain time and you know that person is not there, but you want to intercept that call from a ringing phone, you can dial *8 in that person's extension number, and it'll actually intercept that phone call from their phone. Now, you could take this a step further and actually put extensions in a pickup group, but you could also edit their BLF keys, and all a BLF key is it shows the status of someone using a green and red light, green for if they're idle, blinking red if they're ringing, and solid red if they're currently on call. So if you actually click on a busy lamp field, it'll also intercept that call for you, so you don't actually have to dial *98 and their extension number. Next we have paging in intercom. So one of those features that's very common, once again, the way we do it gives you a couple added features, but for the most part, when you page someone, you are basically only going to talk to them, and they're going to hear audio only from you. You're not going to be hearing anything that they have to say. The other option is intercom, which is basically two-way communication. But with paging and intercom, you can create an extension, and with that extension, it will have an associated group on that. And you'll take selected extensions that you want to participate in this paging and intercom group and move them to the selected region. And once you have done that, anytime you call that extension of that paging group, it will ring the phones within that group that has been selected. Now you can tag alert infos if you want to make that thing ring differently, as well as auto answer, but there is a kind of a trick to auto answer. You will have to edit your phone and go to the account and make sure you go to your intercom and paging settings and allow auto answer by call info or by alert info, however you want to do that. And those phones will automatically answer and play a beep before it sends the audio. But pretty straightforward feature. We do have a couple ways now on the newest firmware in which we can do this. So before, paging and intercom was done through SIP signaling. So it actually sent an invite to each phone, which is great if you want to do maybe 10 to 15 phones. But if you go beyond that, it does stress out the system slightly, and you will get a delay in how each phone will answer that. So a good alternative to paging and intercom is using the multicast function of paging. So it was requested for a while, and we finally have it with the 17.x firmware, but we have the ability to actually do multicast signaling on the UCM. So let's say we didn't want to go through the SIP method route. We can actually enable the multicast function on the intercom and paging section, which will send a multicast audio stream over the IP and port, and there is little to no overhead with multicasting, so all those phones should receive that message that you're playing across almost immediately and without any hesitation whatsoever. Another fun feature is Follow Me. This is a pretty useful feature. All Follow Me does is it's enabled on the extension level. So if you edit someone's extension and you go to the features, you can enable Follow Me, and you can select a couple different options for Follow Me. You can either have it call other extensions or call other external numbers. And really cool. Let's say we have the CEO, very important guy. People need to get a hold of him. Let's say he's at extension 2000, right? But he's actually not currently at his office, and he doesn't like to go over, listen to his voicemails, and someone who may be calling might be very important to him, and he wants to just be able to talk to people. Well, if we enable Follow Me on his extension, it will negate the voicemail, or not technically negate it, because you can kick it back into his voicemail after Follow Me has tried all possible solutions. But within that Follow Me, you can say, we're going to call this extension first, then we're going to call this external number after, then we're going to call this extension on this other peered UCM. You can get very flexible on how many people you want to call in a linear fashion, or you can ring everyone simultaneously, almost like a ring group does. So we can actually have an extension, an external number, and a peered extension through a UCM ring simultaneously, and whoever picks up first will answer that call. This is very helpful, especially when, let's say, that CEO not only has extension 2000, but maybe he has extension 2999 for his GS Wave application, and you also want that to ring simultaneously. You will use the Follow Me feature in order to do that. Another fun feature I like using is call barging. So it's basically as it sounds, and most commonly used for training purposes. But call barging allows an extension to barge in on a conversation that's currently going on with the phone. So we have 3 different ways that we can do this. We can either listen, whisper, or barge. If we're just in a listening state, we're not going to be able to say anything through the speaker. You won't have to worry about both the person receiving the call or making the call hearing you. You're solely just listening to that. The other option is whisper, which is enabled with those feature codes *55. Whisper allows you to talk to the person who is the extension that you're whispering on. So you'll be able to talk to them without the callee actually hearing that part of that conversation. So let's say we have a new guy in support and he kind of doesn't know the bearing or doesn't know the ropes that well. You can barge it and say, hey, you know what, ask him to do this, look for this for me, and you can give him keynotes as he's learning and progressing through his skills. And the alternative is barge, which kind of allows you to come into the conversation really quick and talk to both parties, the caller and the callee. But for the most part, you will have to enable this feature. It's not something that will be enabled by default for security reasons, but once it's enabled, you can use those feature codes plus that person's extension number to use this feature. And next we have sit presence. Now don't get this confused with my example earlier with BLFs. It's not a technical BLF in this case, but it will show you the presence of an extension. The supported presence available to you are available away chatting with someone if someone's on Do Not Disturb. You could also do a custom presence setting on the web UI if need be, and unavailable. But for the most part, this is just showing you how presence works. Obviously, a phone that is looking for the presence of another will subscribe to that extension and get a notification from your PBX. But plain and simple, this allows you to see the status of a set extension. Another really cool feature is instant messaging. Now this is about straightforward as you can get, but you can actually send SMS between phones, and as long as we are on the Asterisk 13, so anything above 9.x on our firmware will support this. But as soon as you compile a message, you can send that to a designated extension in which they can open and read that message from that phone. Pretty self-explanatory. I know we are planning on doing a little bit more with SMS in the future and mass notifications, so keep an eye on that with some future firmware updates. Not want to say too much, but just know that we are coming up with some pretty cool features that are going to be in the future, and will make having a PBX and mass notification or mass SMS a really fun tool to use. I know we touched on this earlier with the alert info and the explanation of that, but our UCM supports the ability to push out distinctive ringtones, and we do this once again with the alert info. But as you can see, the alert info is going to be an option for call queues, IVRs, your inbound routes, as well as extensions. So certain extensions can have certain alert infos that will tell our phones to ring differently. And just remember, like I said before, make sure you're on the latest and greatest firmware, because on the newest firmware that we have currently available, among the release of this video, we should be able to support, I believe, up to 10 ringtones on our GXP phones, so keep your eyes out for that. And just know, you could also create custom ringtones on our phones as well. So if you don't like the default, we can always hook you up with some custom ones, or you can go have some professionally make some ringtones for you. Next, we have speed dial. Pretty straightforward as well. You will set up a speed dial number. If you look at the example in the right hand corner, we have something called extension. Don't let that confuse you. That's going to just be the speed dial number. We can choose to enable or disable the speed dial. We'll set the default destination. This is just basically going to be one of your preferred supported destination types. Like the ones that we went over recently: extension, voicemail, conference room, voicemail group, IVR, ring group, call queues, page group, fax, DISA, dial by name, and an external number if you really wanted to go that far with it. Then from there, you can select your default destination, which is actually going to be the destination it's actually calling when you hit the extension or speed dial code that you have selected. But beyond that, speed dial is pretty straightforward. It basically cuts a 4-digit extension like 1000, and you can shorten it down to a single number of 1. And once anyone dials that on your PBX, it will call that extension. Next, we have dial by name. Now, this is something that a lot of PBXs will support. Not all of them have this, but it is very nice when they do. Let's say you have a customer who's calling into the system. They know the name of the person that they want to contact, but they do not know their extension number. This is where dial by name will help you. You can choose to either have it be presented by first name first or last name last. It all depends. When you have this set up, you're typically going to configure it with an IVR, and the dial by name option will be one of the key pressing events. So we can then press 9, which will then lead into our dial by name. And your users can also pre-program their name into a recorded format. So instead of having our system, which the default setting is to read it out letter by letter, which will just spell out the name like J-A-N-E, you can actually have your users pre-record their name for it, so our UCM will actually retrieve that name recording and play that, just to make things sound a lot cleaner than some robotic voice that will play that back for you. But then, obviously enough, your customer on the calling in will then dial the corresponding letters that equals their name. If we have something that matches pretty similarly to another name, it will list those options in a numbered pattern. So we have 2 names that will match that number. Like let's say we have 2 Nathans in there. It will give you Nathan and the last name for both of them, and you can choose to pick one or the other. Or another alternative, if you don't want to actually choose from there, you can keep dialing both the first and last name, and once it singles out that one, it will then call that number. Another recent option that we currently just added to the UCM is Busy Camp. And all this really does is if you try to call an extension and it is not available, you can be given the option to enable the Busy Camp on by hitting star 11 to request it and star 12 to cancel. But let's say you hit an extension, they're not available for whatever reason, you just hit that star 11, it will camp that person until they become available and connect both you and that caller at a later time. So to understand BusyCamp a little bit more in depth, here's how our UCM will determine availability. Anytime an extension is on a call when BusyCamp is initiated, it will be considered unavailable for the duration of that call. So once they hang up, that phone will become available again, and that's when BusyCamp will allow that previous caller to call to that extension. The other option too is if extension B is taking or trying to make an outgoing call but receives a call from another client that they do not wish to partake in just yet, they can hit the reject button, and as soon as they hit reject, they can make their outgoing call, so that extension will be considered unavailable during that time until it hangs up. And once they hang up, they'll be free again. Our next topic is one that I find very useful, especially when it comes to accessing your voicemail remotely or just trying to make yourself look like you're calling from your business. This is the DISA feature. It stands for Direct Inward System System Access. This is, I would say this is a very commonly used feature, mainly for remote access or for CEOs that like to look like they're working from their business when they're not. But it's pretty straightforward. Oftentimes, like I said before, it's usually set up in an IVR, and when it is set up in an IVR, you can use it as part of your key pressing choices. Oftentimes, it's not solicited in the custom prompt to say that is an option. This is more something that your employees would probably know rather than any random customer knowing. But as soon as they hit the option for the DISA number, they will be prompted to authenticate themselves. So once they enter the password for the DISA, they will then receive dial tone. After they receive dial tone, they could dial anything from outbound routes, any call features just for testing purposes, or dial into someone's voicemail, or maybe dial an extension directly. Everything that you would normally have access to as like a registered extension, you'll also have access as a person calling into DISA. But for the most part, we implement the password, and you cannot negate that. Obviously, you don't want people using this option and just willy-nilly being able to get dial tone from the system. So you will need to make sure you have a pretty good numerical password for your DISA option. But beyond that, it's pretty straightforward to set up. There's about 3 options that you will have to enable to configure this. One's just enabling the DISA, setting it aside for a password, and giving the option whether they want to be able to reorder tone. So that's another thing too within DISA. Let's say you make an outgoing call outside your trunk to make yourself look like you're calling from within the office. You can actually hit, I believe, the star or the pound button to give you reorder tone. And all that really does is hang up that current call and gives you dial tone again. So if you wanted to dial some other service or feature on the UCM, you are free to do so. Up next, we have callback. This is a pretty handy and very courteous feature for anyone calling into the system. As most of you may already know, if you do an outbound call on your cell phone, you are going to be paying for that service charge. But if you receive a call on your cell phone, it's usually free to little of cost. With our callback feature in our UCM, we will give them the ability to call that person back autonomously. So, no one has to actually call that person back. Our system will do that for them. But once they call into a PSTN or a VoIP trunk, it could actually work with both. That caller can then hang up that call and in a few seconds later call that person back, at which point we can then direct them to the DISA or IVR options on our UCM. They can get to whomever they need to speak to and then enjoy their call, knowing that they are not going to get charged for their outgoing call. Now, this is really great for if you have any of your employees traveling internationally and they want to call in through that system. This callback feature will give them that ability to not have to give up their arm and leg just to call out their system. This is definitely a very handy feature, and this is something that I would always implement when setting up a system where employees are going to be accessing it from the outside world. But beyond that, callback is pretty straightforward and easy to set up. Next, we have ring groups. And out of all the call features that we've been over so far, this is probably the #1 most implemented call feature. It is very popular, along with our call queue, which does similar things to the ring group, but gives you more added option. The ring group is just a really good way of just ringing a group of extensions, and we can do up to 100 members per group. We can actually ring in parallel or have serial rings. I mean, we don't use that terminology on our UCM, but what we will call this is we can have it ring each extension individually and ring in an ordered format, or we can ring all extensions within that group simultaneously. You do have the ability to upload your own custom prompt to the ring group, which will play before the ring group call is initiated. You also have the added benefit that anyone that goes into a ring group, you can enable auto record, so whomever picks up that call will immediately start recording the call, and the UCM will save that recording as normal. You also have some timeouts within that ring group, which you can then enable a default destination to it. So if we set out a timeout value on that ring group, the default destination will kick in, and like most of our default destination settings on our PBX, it's going to be other extensions, voicemail group, even voicemails of the extension groups that are participating within the ring group. So that's one little extra option that we put in ring group. But beyond that, there's many more IVRs, external numbers, basically whatever you want. It's pretty limitless for what you can set as the default destination for most of our call features. But beyond that, if you want a group of phones to ring, this is your to-go-to method. If you want a little bit more advanced features, we will go to the call queue. Next, we have our call center. This is a pretty straightforward feature. This is probably going to be interchangeable with the call queue, because when we're talking about our call center, we're really talking about our call queue in conjunction with the dashboard of the UCM, because the UCM will give you a dashboard of what's going on the call queue, and you can end, terminate calls, transfer calls from that dashboard. So it gives you, like I said, a lot more flexibility than the ring group, which would predominantly just ring a group of extensions. You have a lot more adjustability in the call queue. But we support virtual queues, position announcement within our call queues, as well as call queue statistics. It literally has its own section on the UCM where call queue recordings are going to be, or the CDR information just regarding call queues, and you will get a lot of statistic information of who's dropping, how many calls were taken by what agent, and so forth. The switchboard for the agents, user level, can log in and actually manage the call queue using the user management, so you don't have to be logged in as admin, which is a very nice feature. Like I said before in the previous slide on ring groups, the call queue or call center, it gives you more options when it comes to how we're going to be ringing a multitude of endpoints like our agents here. Here's a couple ways we can actually fine-tune our call queue. We can actually have everyone ring simultaneously at the same time. We can initiate fewest calls, so it'll actually ring the person who has taken the fewest calls. That way we can make sure everyone has the same workload. We could also ring in a linear manner, which it'll ring the first agent from the top and flow down two from the bottom. Obviously, the person at the top is going to be the most experienced when you set this up. We could also do random agents as well, so whomever can take the call will take it. That's more similar to how ring groups will work in that function. The other option is least recent, so whoever took the call and has been available for the longest period of time is the least recent agent, and the call will then be routed to them. Your other option that we have here is round robin. This basically is going to ringing agent on a scheduled memory, and it will basically ring the first person first, then move off to the second, third, fourth, and fifth until it gets to the very tail end, but then we'll start back to the first person. Now, the reason why we're saying it's scheduled with memory there is because a lot of times your first person who's going to get hit is going to be your first available on there, so that's why it will start and both potentially end with that customer. Now, in the previous slide, if you were paying attention, it did make a mention at static or dynamic. I didn't bother bringing it up because I knew we were going to talk about it here. It's a pretty easy concept to digest. A static agent is someone that will be permanently fixed in the queue and they cannot log themselves out, versus a dynamic agent gives users the option to either log in the call queue or log out. With that being said, we have a list of how many max agents can be in the call queue at one time per model number. So obviously the 6102 and the 6202s are going to be roughly around 18. 6104 and 6204, 27. The 108 through the 16 is going to be 36. The 6208, there you can kind of see the processing power differential there, can handle up to 60, and our 6510 will be able to do 120. With that being said, the difference between static and dynamic is pretty straightforward. Continuing on, call queues in the call center. Here's an example of the overview of the call center display. As you can see, it really gives you a bird's eye view onto the phone system, in which you can see extensions, you can control and see their visibility. Checking extension status in real time is going to be an option for you, so you can see who's actually unavailable, ringing, or in a calling state. You could also adjust the agent's in queue, monitor, transfer, and hang up calls all on the web. So our call center is something that's actually new to our PBX series. It's one of those features that have been recently added thanks to our free firmware updates. Remember, you have those for life. But beyond that, this is something that, if you don't want something very basic like a ring group and you want a little bit more control on it, recommend using call queues. Show your users how to use the dashboard and how to control calls. And you can even pull call recordings directly from this page as well, so keep that in mind. With our call center, just know that you have full control. If you do receive a call on the queue, you're not going to be limited to any features. They should all be available to you. So if you want to put calls on hold, or you want to transfer calls or do a conference while you have taken a call from the queue, you can do so. Call parking is also available. If you want to use your BLF keys on your phone, you are free to do so without limitation. As well as using the switchboard directly on the UCM's webpage. Another really cool advantage of using the call queue over ring groups is that in a call queue you can actually use a virtual queue, which allows callers who call into your system to keep their position on the call queue without actually having to stay in that ringing state on that phone. They can be free to do with whatever they want. But once it is activated, our UCM's really good at directing the caller to setting up their callback number and saving their spot on the queue. Once they have hung up, they will stay in that position virtually, and as soon as the next available agent is able to pick up that call, it will immediately call the callback number in which that caller will then be connected. This is a very convenient feature, especially when you're trying to be courteous to customers calling inward. You don't want to waste their time any more than you have to, especially if you're working on a business that is taking calls in and out and you have a long wait times for your queue. There is also the ability to have a position announcement, both when you're not using the virtual queue, basically when you're not using this feature. So if someone is calling to the queue, you can constantly hear your position being updated. So very handy and very common feature, but just know that you have that. Up next, we have the chairman/supervisor. Now this is a call queue feature in which you can select any extension you want to be set as a chairman, and whomever that extension is registered to should have the credentials in which part they could log into our system and be able to have control over what goes on in the call queue directly from the dashboard. Now, just a quick note, there can only be one chairman per call queue. You can't add more than one chairman on a multitude of call queues. So just be wary of that when setting this up. And to finish up this slide, please note down this interesting point. This is a true statement. Caller center chairman can monitor and manage multiple virtual queues. Just keep that in mind, that is a true statement. Up next, we have the call center switchboard. This is basically what we've talked about earlier regarding the dashboard. I tend to use switchboard and dashboard interchangeably, so forgive me for that. But for the most part, it allows either the admin account to adjust what's going on in the call queue, or if we assign a user with the chairman level access onto a particular call queue, this is the dashboard or switchboard that they'll have access to. It gives them the range of monitoring calls in real time, as well as hanging up or transferring calls. You'll have a lot of fun, managing these calls with the dashboard. It's very intuitive, and you can learn it straight off the bat. Usually when I set this up for a lot of my customers, the moment that they look at the dashboard, they basically already know how to work with it. So it's really easy to get and understand right from the bat. Next, we have the user dashboard. Now, what the user dashboard is for each extension, they will have their extension number, which they're going to use as a username if they hit the web page of the UCM. From their extensions general page, you should also see a user password in there, which they'll use to authenticate themselves to the UCM and get this dashboard. From there, they can look at their voicemails, they can set up wake-up services, they can set their do not disturb whitelist, transfer calls, they could even use some WebRTC settings, they could send fax directly from the UCM. They could look at their call queue and also work with the CRM user settings. Now, we haven't gotten to CRM just yet, but we will get there. For the most part, though, if you do specify a chairman, that chairman will have access to other user extensions as well, so keep that in mind. Next, we have the call queue statistics. This is going to be the area where you're going to have a lot of transparencies on what's going on with your call queue. So you can see stuff like who transferred, who answered, who's not answering phone calls, if there's any abandoned calls, people just dropping off the calls, not wanting to wait any longer. You could even see average talk times, and there's a lot of nice statistic reporting tools in which you can use for filters, as well as selecting your start time and date, and you can even select what queues you want to do, or even see what agents you want to monitor. So this is a really easy way that both you as a network administrator, programming the system, could test and verify if the call queue is working correctly, as well as if you are the agent responsible for managing the queue and just wanting to keep tabs on all your employees and making sure that they're doing their job. Next, we have our fax service on our UCM. So typically with our UCM, you don't actually need a physical fax machine, but for those who like having a fax machine, we can hook it up directly. Our UCM will support T30 and T38, and we can even operate fax through pass-through, which allows us, if we're receiving a fax on either a VoIP trunk or an analog line, to pass it directly through to a designated fax extension. Now, a lot of times, the most common setups I've seen with a physical fax machine is hooking a fax machine directly to the FXS port of our UCM, and then we can control fax routing from there. We even have an onboard or virtual fax machine within the UCM in which you can both receive fax, log into the UCM, and download those fax that come into the system, as well as sending fax outward on the web UI of the UCM as well. So just as easy as picking the number you want to send a fax to, uploading the document directly to the UCM's web interface, and clicking send, you can send a fax to anywhere in the world. Next feature we have is the wake up service. Now I know I did mention this before in some previous slides, but we're going to go into more details on what it is actually set for. So wake up service is a pretty handy feature. You can set this up either through the phone with the feature codes presented available to you with the wake up service, which is *36. Your other alternate option, and tend to be most favored by most of my customers, is logging in through the web portal and setting up the wake up service from there. But you can enable the wake up service, set the name for that wake up service, select your extension, and put a wake up prompt call, or you can actually create custom prompts and add whatever prompt that you want. But you will end up hearing that prompt if you answer that phone call. You can select different days that you might want this to happen, as well as select the time and program an action status to that wake up service. Up next, we have the Announcement Center. Now, if you ever wanted to send a pre-recorded message to a group of extensions, the Announcement Center is your key to doing that. You can create a custom prompt, as mentioned before in previous slides, and go to the Announcement Center, assign that custom prompt a number, at which point you can create a group of extensions and assign that group a number. And by dialing the announcements, the custom prompt call recording number in conjunction with the group that you want to send it to, and you dial that, it will send that pre-recorded message to that group of extensions. I mean, it might be obvious, but this is something that is often used for emergency situations. If there is a fire being reported, or if someone has to call emergency services, you can quickly dial the call recording number and their group code and send this message to whomever you may choose. Up next, we have call recording. So our UCM series is able to record calls, whether it's on an extension call, ring group calls, inbound route calls, or we can even enable call recording on trunks as well. But for the most part, our UCM will handle up to 10,000 minutes of recorded calls before it will be full. One thing you will have to consider, if you ever want to hold more, you could always stick in a USB drive into the UCM to add to more call recording storage. We even have options within the UCM in which we can store a lot of call recording information over to a separate server. So if you have a TFTP server, we can actually send that over to the TFTP server and have those recordings backed up, while the UCM will refresh its memory and build new recordings for itself. Now, we can either have recordings be automatically enabled, or we can enable recordings directly from an extension by dialing a feature code. But for the most part, this is something that is very useful, especially in hospitals or lawyers' offices. Up next, we have API and third-party integration. Now, this is something that is going to have a lot of test questions in it. So pay very close attention on the next couple slides. I'll do my best to, wouldn't say give you the answer, but get you pointed in the right direction. So have your notepad and pens ready. Up next, we have the CDR API. Plain and simple, this allows our UCM to work with a third-party billing interface. So if you ever wanted to create a support center and you wanted to charge incoming callers on a permanent basis, this is your go-to method in order to accomplish this. We will output formats we support 3 output formats, which is going to be CSV, XML, and a JSON format. For security purposes, you will have to authenticate yourself with the username and password with that API software. I think this is going to be standard amongst a lot of PBXs that will support this type of third-party integration. But just know that you have this as a tool to your disposal, so you can actually make money while taking and receiving calls. just as a third-party billing software will try to access your CDR for call records and call times, we have a similar function with the API, which will also allow these third-party softwares to get call recordings as well. So if you have a system in which that is constantly wanting to back up and you're not using a TFTP and you wanted something a little bit smarter, you would be going with a third-party software to ask and request for the call recordings on our UCM. Very helpful for lawyers' offices who may request this feature. I've actually seen a couple of my customers want this integrated on their system, and predominantly I've seen this done with lawyers or even schools sometimes. It all depends. Another option we have for third-party devices is access to Asterisk Management Interface. Now, we're not going to have every bit of access that most people are familiar with an Asterisk system, but you will have low-level access to certain features on Asterisk, but this is available for your disposal, and you can actually have this interface with a third-party software to pull information from the Asterisk Management Interface, even initiate calls, track the state of certain phone calls that are going on. The UCM will provide, like I said, a restricted AMI access for administrators. So you're not going to be changing anything on the back end. This is mainly for logging purposes and kind of checking on what's going on the system through the Asterisk Management Interface. Up next, we have the CRM integration with our PBX. And all this really does is, as calls come in on the PBX, if you have it working with this third-party software, it will pass off information that third-party software will take and add to its database. That way, if someone's calling in on the system, you can see directly from your desktop who's calling in, and you'll have a customer history provided to you by the third-party software, which basically helps a lot of customer relationships that are being established when you're doing business with your customers. You're not guessing anymore on who's calling in, and you should have a pretty good idea of who the caller is once they call in, and answer to them as if you've known them your whole life. So in general, this is really used for data analytics and being able to get to know or getting to know your customer base using a lot of this helpful third-party software. But just so you know, we are going to support this. I would make an interesting note for the Sugar CRM and seeing what it supports versus Salesforce. I'd pay very close attention to that because it does sound like a test question. So I will give you a few seconds for you to look at that and write that down. All right, for our next slide, this is regarding PMS. Now, what PMS actually is, it stands for Property Management Systems, and this is oftentimes software that you'll be running in conjunction with a PBX. Now, our PBX comes in because it has features on it that will plug directly into the PMS software and be able to update stuff like check-in, check-out status, update entries. We have a mini bar section where if a maid is cleaning up a room and she sees that items are taken out, she can actually update the PMS software solely using one of our phones and calling into our system and updating the status of that mini bar. We also have do not disturb. I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, but wake up services, actually setting a time for a customer in a hotel room of when they want to hang up. Very common feature for a lot of hospitality services and so forth. Now, there are going to be a couple, I can't even say a couple questions. There are going to be 3 questions on the test that you'll have to keep in mind. And the wording of these might throw you off a bit, but please take note. UCM integration with H-Mobile PMSI allows UCM to be compatible with all PMS systems already compatible with H-Mobile. This is a true statement. So our PBX does work with other systems that are compatible with H-Mobile. And for our next interesting note, the UCM has a built-in PMS service. Now that is inherently false. Now we have parameters on our UCM that plug into PMS, but our UCM does not run PMS software on it. It's going to rely on a third-party PMS software like H Mobile, then to plug into our services that we provide, such as monitoring check-in and check-out statuses and so forth. But just know our UCM does not have a built-in PMS service. It has functions of it, but it doesn't have software that's going to integrate like H Mobile. And for my next interesting topic, this one's a little bit more confusing even for someone like myself. The difference between PMS and PMSI is the difference of it being middleware. So PMSI is actually middleware between a PMS software and a PBX. So just keep that in note. PMSI is middleware between PMS and a PBX. This will conclude our PowerPoint presentation. I really hope you found this PowerPoint presentation helpful, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the webinar chat, or if you're watching this through YouTube, feel free to please leave a comment on any critiques or anything that you might like to add to this PowerPoint presentation. I look forward to hearing your responses. And with that being said, good luck and you have a good one.